Next, I'm delighted to invite Dr. Celia McMichael to come and talk to us. Celia is a lecturer in the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne. She's got a background in geography, medical anthropology, international development, and epidemiology. She's worked in the area of forced migration and health, including with World Health Organization in Angola and UNFPA in Sri Lanka. She has focused particularly on this question of environmental change and human migration, and that will be what she's going to speak to us to now.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity to speak at the panel today. As Alistair said, I'm going to be looking at climate-related migration in Pacific Island countries and health impacts. We've heard quite a bit from Colin about some of the more direct and indirect pathways via which climate change impacts will affect the health of populations in Pacific Islands. But what I'm going to talk about specifically is the less well understood and quite complex relationships between climate change, how that shapes human migration and mobility, and the health impacts for people on the move in Pacific Island countries. So first, I thought I'll contain how much I say, but it's worth just pointing out some of the relationships between how climate change will affect human mobility globally. It's increasingly understood that climate change is shaping human migration, forced displacement, and relocation. Now, you need to interpret a broad brush global map such as this with some caution, but you can see in blue it's highlighting areas that could be affected by sea level rise, so deltaic regions, small island states, low-lying coastal areas. And it's expected that, say, anywhere between 70 to 180 million people could be displaced if the sea level rises by a metre or so by the end of the century. There's also exposure to things like desertification and drought, where that loss of ecosystem services can impair livelihoods and food security, which could amplify human migration. And one of the third big impacts of climate change on migration will be via disasters, which lead to, as we know, short-term displacement. So every year at the moment, there's about 25 million people displaced. That's 3 times more than are displaced by violence and conflict. So, you know, they're big figures. And we'd expect that with climate change, those numbers are going to increase in coming years and decades. And, you know, Colin gave us some examples from the Pacific where environmental disaster are leading to displacements of people. But before I move on, I just would like to point out that there's a bit of a challenge in the way climate-related migration gets talked about. You'll often hear the term climate refugees, which is how the media reports it, but this is not going to be a scenario where people are flooding across international borders, say from the Pacific, coming to Australia or high-income countries. A lot of the migration and mobility is going to occur within countries, which of course means that it's vulnerable countries and places which will need to deal with people on the move. The second caveat is the problem of actually identifying an environmental migrant or a climate refugee. People will not be moving just because of climate change. It occurs for people that have other political, demographic, economic, social reasons to move, so they might already experience other types of social economic disadvantage. So it's an amplifier. Climate change is an amplifier of migration and mobility. So I'll return to the question that I'm supposed to be focusing on, which is the relationship between climate migration and health. So how is it that human experience of climate change will lead to movement of people, and what will be the health opportunities and risks for people that are on the move in Pacific Island countries? It's been estimated that about 1.7 million people could be displaced by climate change across Pacific Islands in coming decades. This is something that a lot of people are aware of. There's a high awareness amongst government and public officials, ambassadors, and also at the community level. but people do not wish to be labelled refugees. They're not drowning. They want a viable future. So there is a very strong pushback of saying, don't assume that we're going to move. The preference is for the global community to mitigate climate impacts so that it's not necessary. And if it does occur, it's an option of last resort. Overall, I would say that the health impacts for people that are displaced are going to be problematic. So if you take the first type of mobility, disaster-related forced displacement, the Pacific, although they don't have the biggest numbers of displacement due to environmental disaster, if you look at it on a per capita basis, they're in the top 10 countries of environmental disaster-related displacement. So you can see, I hope, I know that font's a little small, but Fiji is up there with 6,900 people displaced per 100,000 inhabitants in 2016 from Cyclone Winston. You can see Tonga's up there, Tropical Cyclone Zena affecting Fiji. So it becomes clear that the Pacific is a site where population displacement due to cyclones and environmental disaster is a very real issue that's happening now. When people are displaced following an environmental disaster, usually the health impacts they're problematic. So where you have forced displacement leading to overcrowding, there's the risk of infectious disease, mental health impacts on continuing with vaccinations, access to health services. There's very little data that's actually reported on this in the Pacific Islands, including for displaced populations. So clearly this is something where there's going to be a need for more understanding, more data in order to actually address this problem of environmental disaster, displacement and health. Perhaps the less dramatic scenario of displacement and migration is where people move in response to climate drivers such as, say, drought and impaired impacts on livelihood or food security. So this is a picture taken from Papua New Guinea, where the urban population is growing very rapidly, and a lot of that is due to rural-urban migration. Now, of course, some of that is for economic, social, educational reasons, but there is evidence that people are also beginning to move in response to adverse climate impacts such as drought. And in a lot of cases, they're ending up in these peri-urban, poor areas where there are health challenges, lack of health service provision, inadequate drainage, exposure to infectious diseases, which I think we'll hear about from Maxine next. Again, the data are limited. As of 2015, not one of the Pacific Islands actually appears in the UN Statistics Division Global Monitoring of Slum Populations. And this is one of the big Sustainable Development Goal themes. So yet again, the Pacific Islands are suffering from just that lack of data to support and advocate for action. And the last type of mobility I wanted to touch on is the one that I work on most closely, and that's climate-related relocation. So this is probably the most highly publicised form of climate movement. You've probably all heard about these predictions that Kiribati and Tuvalu will all need to move if their islands are inundated by sea level rise. Without discounting the really dire risks of climate change, it is worth pointing out again that these are complex biophysical processes. There is the possibility that adaptation initiatives will mean people do manage to stay in the countries where they want to be and where they belong. And of course, if we manage to achieve drastic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, then an alternative future is possible. So displacement and relocation due to sea level rise is not a predetermined certainty, but there are already cases of relocation that are occurring. So you can see here some images from Nuatambu village in Solomon Islands. On the left-hand side is an aerial photo taken in 2017. On the right side, you can see how that coastline has eroded over 50 years or so. And the bottom figures are showing you what those villages have done. So they're relocating to the mainland, some close by, some longer distances. But as they're moving into inland, steeper settlements, all of these villages are facing challenges with sanitation, with water supply, with access to health services, and mental health impacts. These are some images taken from Narakoso, which is one of the villages that I work in Fiji. You can see a figure showing the houses that are at the closest to the shore, and at the moment the funding and the decision is that they will relocate these houses uphill away from the risk of coastal erosion and inundation. So the photos on the right I've taken, you can see the seawall being breached at high tide. But the village is fairly anxious about this. It means splitting a whole community into two sites, which disrupts that sociocultural integrity, the impacts for mental health. There's a lot of concern about access to water, and the villagers have been working really hard to raise funds for a water supply at the new site. Perhaps the best known case is Vunidongoloa, which was the first village in Fiji to relocate. They approached the government and asked for funding, and in 2014 moved up the hill. Their seawall was broken and damaged. They had saltwater intrusion, damaged homes and crops. So they've built a new village site. There's 30 new houses up the hill. And in some ways, this is almost a bit of a good news story, that they've got fish ponds, pineapple plantations, bananas, and there's this kind of diversity of livelihood and food security. I think that's worth noting because generally you think migration is an indicator of vulnerability, but if it's done well, with people choosing how it occurs and when it occurs, then there is potential to enhance health. So, yeah, just the final slide. I think I'm reiterating what Colin said, and I imagine what the next few speakers will say is that this is a global moral issue and a question of climate justice. People's lives, health are being compromised at that local level due to greenhouse gas emissions produced elsewhere. As one man explained to me in Narakoso village, other big countries cause the problem and the small countries suffer. And I think that's a very clear statement of the global incentive that something needs to be done to address this situation. So highlighting the health consequences of migration disrupts this assumption that migration is a form of adaptation, a display of resilience. It provides impetus and an obligation to address the constellation of inequalities and create a low-carbon world. Thanks.